Hello. Certain far-right morons have recently just learned what the term dhimmi means and have started bringing it up incessantly, so I wanted to talk about what dhimmi/dhimmitude actually was, just for a little bit here informally, to educate people on very basic things about history that are apparently news to some, because they knew nothing about anything until it was time for them to try and look up random shit on the internet to try and win arguments with people who they hate. I myself am the founder of the dhimmi-maxing movement, which is where people try to maximize their dhimmitude by voluntarily submitting themselves to the status of dhimmi and by, for example, expressly seeking out the honor of becoming a janissary. Anyway, so the dhimmi status is a historical, no longer existing status that existed in the past for around about a millennia or so in countries that were ruled under Islamic law as Islamic states. It was a status that was mostly given to Christians and Jews, who were considered to be people of the same book that Islam is derived from, and the word literally means protected person. This term is often evoked as like an example of like historical, unthinkable Muslim oppression of Jews and Christians, but in reality, it is way better than the way that minorities were handled in Europe and European-derived societies in this same time period. Infinitely better. So someone who had dhimmi status had a set of rights and obligations towards the state as a result of this status. These were rights and obligations that were not really that different from those that Muslims had. Dhimmis, for example, were obliged to pay a head tax called the jizya. However, Muslims themselves were obliged to pay a tax called the zakat. And these taxes were basically the same thing in effect, except dhimmis were, as a result of paying this tax, exempt from mandatory military service, while Muslims were not. So if anything, in that respect, they were advantaged, not disadvantaged. And that was like really the main thrust of what dhimmitude was, is like that one difference in rights. So there were also others. For example, Muslims were not allowed to attempt to convert people who were recognized as dhimmis, and people who were recognized as dhimmis were also not allowed to be converted, as in it was literally illegal for them to convert to Islam, and this was not an oppressive thing. It was rather a law that was instituted in an effort to sort of foster religious harmony between people of different faiths in order to prevent them just like constantly trying to forcibly convert each other or evangelizing each other, which would then cause, communal issues between different religions. So dhimmis were protected from conversion and also were not allowed to convert, and this also went the other way as well. Muslims could not evangelize them and they could not evangelize Muslims. The Christian and Jewish communities in these places were also allowed to govern themselves, both civilly and criminally, based on their own particular versions of religious law in any matter that did not involve someone of another faith. So they actually had quite an expansive degree of autonomy. They were essentially self-governing autonomous communities in a wider state, something that, again, one could not imagine having been allowed for minorities in Europe or in the European-derived settler colonies contemporaneous to these Muslim states. There were actually, at least in some places, some actually oppressive elements to this status. For example, in some places, dhimmis were not allowed to build new religious buildings and stuff like that, though they were allowed to maintain the ones that they already had. And they sometimes had to wear some sort of identifying marker, though in most cases this wasn't actually necessary because Christians, Jews, and Muslims generally dressed at least slightly differently to the point where it made them identifiable. This is often framed as some sort of like apartheid system, but it really wasn't. Civically, dhimmis had all the same rights as Muslims did. If anything, they actually had fewer obligations as a result of this dhimmi status. And this is something that has to be compared with the treatment of minorities and religious minorities in particular in Europe at the time. Spain, for example, forcibly expelled all Jews and Muslims unless they converted, and then even if they did convert, they were considered to have tainted blood for life that still made them a lower class of person innately. And this tainted blood was inherited by their children and their children's children, etc. The dhimmi status is a whole lot better than that, let me tell you. And that is precisely why, when the Jews were expelled, along with the Muslims, from Spain, they all went to the North African Muslim states, because they had actual rights and protections there when they were literally not even allowed to live and practice their religion in Europe in most places. Spain is not the only place that expelled Jews in particular. The main reason why it expelled Muslims as well as Jews, is because it was one of the only places that had a significant Muslim population. England, for example, expelled all Jews multiple times, with many of them ending up in other parts of Europe or in North Africa and the Arab world. The very reason why there is such a thing as Arab Jews is in large part because Jews who were forcibly expelled by Europeans went to Muslim states where they actually had rights. And this makes it particularly ludicrous because the people who usually bring up dhimmitud as some sort of gotcha are explicitly European supremacists. They hate Muslims, they hate Islam, they hate brown people, they think white people are superior, Europeans are superior, Christianity is superior, stuff like that. And then they bring it up as like, sort of gotcha, like, look, these Muslims oppressed Christians and Jews, when the actual reality is that while such a system would clearly be unacceptable in the world today, to most of us today, it was way better than the alternatives at the time, like literal state-enforced racism and racial slavery in the US, for example, the mass racial genocides by the Spanish in the Americas, for example, European countries expelling all Jews and forcing them to go and live in the Muslim states of North Africa and the Arab world, for example. Compared to what the contemporaneous Europeans were doing, this shit was a dream. Hell, compared to Israel today, right now, this shit was a dream. And that's saying a lot, because it wasn't exactly a great system. It just was nowhere near as bad as the racial supremacist, apartheid, settler colonial state of Israel, which is especially ironic given that Zionists love to bring up dhimmitud as like some sort of horrible subhuman status, when even in the late Ottoman Empire, before it broke down and things like the Armenian genocide were carried out, interreligious and inter-ethnic relations were way better than they ever have been in the Zionist state of Israel. And again, that's not to say they were perfect, but it does say something about how fucking bad Israel is. So yeah, I just wanted to talk about that because a lot of the dumbest people in the world just recently learned this term, and I think it's worth a short little video talking about it and refuting the bullshit that they're making up on the spot, likely just based on ChatGPT feeding them talking points. Anyway, see ya.